Hey everyone, it's SmartyPants Chess. We're going to look at another Leela Chess Zero Stockfish game today in the Season 17 Superfinal. So this is round 14 or game 14, and in this game Leela is playing with the white pieces and Stockfish is playing black. And the book moves were as follows. It was d4, knight to f6, c4, c5, d5, e6, knight c3, takes, d6, knight to f3, g6, and knight to d2, and this is the end of the book, and we're into a modern Benoni. Now usually when I've played through other games between these two engines and the modern Benoni is played, black always seems to lose, and we'll see what happens in this game. So Stockfish continued with bishop g7, Leela played e4, black castled, Leela developed a bishop to e2, and black played knight b to d7, and I guess the idea for black now is to play a6, b5, knight to e5, and maybe try and strike out with an f5 at some point as well. But Leela continued h3, so covering the g4 square and maybe preparing to play f4 for white and really sort of stifle black's position. So knight to e8 was played, maybe going to reroute the knight to c7 followed by f5, we'll see. But anyway, Leela castled kingside, and Stockfish got on with the plan of playing b5, so played a6 first to prepare b5. And this is now where white always plays a4 to stop black from playing this b5 move, which will really help black's position if they can get that in. So they play rook b8, again preparing b5, but white's got a lot of pieces covering this square. They've got the pawn, the knight and the bishop, all stopping the pawn from being pushed to b5 at this moment in time. But Leela plays an interesting move, so knight to c4 here. Which is actually quite a nice move because he prepares to play a5 and really sort of limit black's position. If white can get maybe a5 in at some point and knight b6, they're doing quite well. Now black could have played b5 here, but it's actually really good for white because white could have taken, and if takes, play knight to a5 and just prepare to play knight to c6 and hit the queen. If black plays bishop b7, of course, white can just take this pawn off, knight takes b5. After knight c4 I also looked at f5 here for black. I wondered if they could play this, but again after takes and just bishop f4, this pawn under d6 comes under a lot of fire. And after knight to e5, queen d2, queen c7, white can play rook f to e1, and actually white's got a really nice position. Let's say knight takes c4, bishop takes, bishop d7, and just a5. I just put here white's got a very nice position, basically got the open file. They've got bishop pointing at this weak d6 pawn, and this a pawn is always up the board, stopping black from progressing with b5, and white's just got a nice space advantage. So going back to the game, knight c4 was a very nice move, and Stockfish continued with queen to e7. Leela now played f4, so gaining more space on the king side and preparing maybe e5 ideas. But first black played bishop d4 with check, the king went to h2, and Stockfish put their knight onto f6. Okay, attacking this e4 pawn, and the bishop on d4 also attacks the only defender of this pawn, knight on c3. e5 was definitely a possibility that white could have played here, and if captures then f takes e5 can be played. If black takes this off again with check, knight takes and queen takes to check, bishop f4 is actually just a great move, attacks the queen and the rook at the same time. So after knight d7 in this position, then white can play e6, after f takes e6, d takes e6. There's an array of moves now that black could play. I looked at queen takes e6, but then comes rook takes f8, knight takes f8, bishop to f4 hits the rook, rook a8, queen d2, bishop d7, rook e1. And again I think white's got a nice position. After queen f7 to get off the e-file, white can follow in with knight to e5, attacking the queen, and after queen g7, take on d7, and just play knight to e4. And white's idea now is to play maybe knight g5 followed by bishop c4 check, and you have to favour white in this position. Okay, white's a pawn down, but the evaluation from Stockfish is +3, and I tend to agree because white's pieces are coming in very fast here. Now just going back here, black doesn't have to take on e6 in this variation. They could have played knight to e5, but again after bishop f4, queen g7, e7. The best move given for black here is actually rook takes f4, an exchange sacrifice. After takes, queen takes e7, king h1, bishop f5. Again, this still slightly favours white. So black's got an extra bishop and a pawn for the rook, But the exchange is actually quite useful in the endgame, and I think white's got a decent position here. They could actually even sacrifice the rook back, rook takes d4 here if they wanted to. So e5 was definitely possible, but I don't think it was the optimum move. Instead, Leela just played bishop to f3, defending the pawn on e4. But now comes bishop takes c3, pawn takes, and black does win the pawn, knight takes e4. Now I don't think Leela's ever going to swap this good bishop off for that knight, so she plays queen to e1, so pinning the knight against the queen, and black's forced to play f5, which protects the knight on e4, but locks in this bishop now, and it can't get out to a good square. And now Leela plays knight to b6, preparing to play c4, maybe followed by bishop to b2, and again this knight just blockades the b pawn, and just sort of limits black's activity. The knight went to f6, white played c4, getting on with the idea of protecting d5, and this knight on b6 actually does a great job of protecting c4 and also this a4 pawn. Black played bishop d7, so hitting the a4 pawn, but white played rook a3, and the point is now this knight on b6 protects the a pawn, and if this queen ever comes to d8, then I guess white will just play rook to b3, and all these pieces are just protecting themselves, so the rook will protect the knight and the knight protects these pawns. Black played h5, gaining some space, king went back to g1, rook f7 was played, and rook to e3 by Leela, so again putting more pressure on this knight on e4. a5 was now played by black. Now a5 was an interesting move because it basically stops white from playing a5 themselves to protect this knight on b6. I guess black's next move will be queen to d8 to attack this knight, which is protecting this pawn on a4 for white, and this bishop hits the pawn. So white will have some defending to do, so pretty much after a5 black's giving back the pawn and white's pretty much forced to accept it. That's what happens. Leela takes the pawn, and as predicted, queen to d8, so pinning this knight on b6. So the queen's always got to protect this knight at this moment in time, and this queen is still attacking the knight, so basically white's got to wait for black to move their queen unless they protect it with rook to b3 first. The good thing is though, this knight stops the rook on b8 coming into a8, which is quite nice for white. It gives them some respite anyway. But Leela's probably fine here. She plays bishop b2, gets the bishop to a really good square. h4 is played, so okay, black's copying what white did, pushing their h-pawn, stopping white getting any g4 ideas in. But white still builds up more pressure, rook f e1, doubling on the e-file, and now there's immense pressure on this knight on e4. King h7 was played, rook to b3 by Leela, so finally this queen on a5 is free to move. But Stockfish moves their queen first, moves it back to f8. Now amazingly Leela gives up her really good bishop on b2 here, but it's not without its reasons, so bishop takes f6 was played, and suddenly this knight on b6 attacks this bishop on d7, so black's forced to take back with the knight, which protects the bishop. But after queen d2, queen g7 and now a5, suddenly white's got their position in order. The a-pawn protects the knight on b6 and the knight stops the rook coming into a8. And now basically white's free to move their rooks to wherever they want to, probably on the open file again, and just start harassing black's position. King g8 was played by Stockfish. Queen f2 hits the pawn on h4. So g5 was played. I don't think white wants to take this off, because if queen takes, then let's say knight takes d7, knight takes d7. It's fairly even for both sides. Both sides have a set of minor pieces each, and probably the knight will jump into e5. So it's probably hard for either side to win this game. But after g5, Leela went in for a better position. She played knight takes the bishop. The knight takes the bishop and played bishop h5, hitting the rook on f7. It drops back to f8, but now Leela seizes her opportunity. She plays rook e6, attacking the pawn on d6. Knight to f6 was played, maybe preparing to play knight to e4 if white takes this pawn off, or attack the bishop on h5 at the same time. So queen e2 was played to protect the bishop. If knight to e4 here, then rook g6 just wins the queen. So Stockfish played queen h6, attacking the bishop once again, which drops back to f3. And it's quite a good bishop that, because it stops the knight jumping into e4. Now I did look at g takes f4 here for black. I mean, they won a pawn at the expense of doubling their f-pawns. I thought it was quite interesting. But I think white gains the better of it with rook takes d6. If rook f7, then you can play a6, and this pawn on b7 is just pinned. Again, I went through this variation with queen g7, queen e6, preparing to play a7. b5 was considered the best move, but then white can just play a7. And if rook a8, rook takes b5, rook takes a7, rook b8, just wins for white after king h7, queen takes f5, queen g6, and rook h8 at the end of it, and white will take the queen off at the next move. Or if king g7, then of course there's just rook to g8. Either way, white will pick up the queen on the next move, and white's got a great position. So that makes sense why black didn't take on f4, it just opens up black's position. He played g4 instead though, hitting the bishop on f3. So takes, bishop takes g4, and queen takes f4. So a pair of pawns has just been traded off, and black's now attacking this bishop on g4. Leela retreats it back to h3, a check is thrown in, queen e1, and now there is a trade of queens. Stockfish plays king to g7. So all of a sudden it looks very equal for both sides here, but don't be deceived, white's actually in complete control of this position, just because the pawn on d6 is so weak for black. So Leela strikes, rook b6, attacks the d6 pawn, the rook defends, and now Leela attacks the other pawn. Rook eb1 attacking the b7 pawn and prepares to play a6. Rook a8 is played, so Stockfish realises he's going to have to give up this pawn. So rook takes b7 check, king g6, and Leela just gets behind the pawn with rook to a1. Black tries to blockade this pawn, but Leela's having none of it. She plays rook b6, rook a7 is played, and now a6. So this pawn for Leela is moving very fast up the board here, protected by two rooks. And also this rook does a great job of attacking d6. King g5 was played by Stockfish. I looked at rook b7 here for white. I think it's possible, but black has to play rook a8, and after takes, maybe they could play bishop c8 for black, knight to e4, rook f1. This is still really good for white, so it's definitely possible to play. But Leela went for a different approach. She played rook to f1 now. The rook on b6 still protects the a pawn. Knight h5 was played, rook f5 check, king g6, and an amazing move actually, a really nice move by Leela, quite sneaky, rook e5. So the d pawn is pinned, and basically white just wants to play rook e6 check and pick up this d6 pawn. So after a bit of shuffling, knight to f4, stopping rook e6 check. The king went to h2, the king went to h6, Leela attacked the knight, which jumped back to h5, bishop g4 attacks the knight again, which jumps into g3, and rook e5, preparing to play rook e6 check again. King g6 is played, but first white plays bishop d1, so black can't play king g5 if rook e6 check. Rook f7 was played, bishop c2 check, the king went to f6, and finally Leela gets in this move, rook e6 check. And after king g5, they win the pawn on d6. After exchange of rooks, Stockfish has to blockade this pawn again, rook a7, and just bishop to d3 from Leela, stopping the knight on g3 from jumping into any of these squares. Basically the only square available to this knight is h5 if they don't want to trade it off. Stockfish continued with king to f4, Leela calmly plays rook e6, king went to g4, king g1, the king to g5, and basically Leela's just getting the king out of this corner. The knight did go to h5, but now the king comes up, knight to f6, king e3, and check. And now basically all Leela needs to do is get their king around the other pawn. So she protects the g2 pawn with the bishop, the rook has to go back to a7, king b3, knight g4, and the king's coming up the board. Slowly but surely they win another pawn. There's a check thrown in, but this is probably too much for black now. Knight c5, a7, a few checks again, manoeuvring the king around, but eventually this is a nice move by Leela, just g3 with check. The point is, if h takes g3, bishop g2 can be played, and if knight to f6, just push these pawns up. And if the knight takes on g3, white can just play d6, and one of these pawns is just going to be absolutely unstoppable. So I clearly won endgame for white. So going back to this g3 move, Stockfish played king to f3, the pawn took on h4, rook a8 to blockade the pawn, but now it's just over. Bishop g2 is a nice move, king takes g2, rook takes e4, Rook takes the pawn on a7, but now white just pushes these pawns up the board, and that's pretty much all she wrote. King b6 and Stockfish resigned the game. It's clearly too much with these two passed pawns. So again, another black loss in the modern Benoni. I've never seen black actually win one of these engine games playing the modern Benoni yet, which is quite interesting in itself. But anyway, that was really nicely played positionally by LeelaChessZero once again, and I hope you enjoyed my analysis. Please join me again tomorrow, where I'll post another video between these two giants of the game. If you haven't already, please do like, comment and subscribe. Anyway, I hope you're all staying really safe at home, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.